Denial is one of the most subtle yet powerful psychological defense mechanisms operating beneath human behavior. It doesn't always appear as outright rejection of reality. More often, it disguises itself as normalcy, silence, or even indifference. When someone hurts you and then acts as if nothing happened, denial is frequently at the core of that reaction. It allows a person to distance themselves from the emotional weight of their actions without ever confronting the consequences. At its root, denial is a way for the mind to protect itself from discomfort. Acknowledging that you have hurt someone, especially someone who trusted you, creates internal conflict. This conflict, often experienced as guilt or shame, can be deeply unsettling. Rather than processing those emotions, many individuals unconsciously choose to suppress or ignore them. By behaving as though nothing occurred, they create a temporary escape from the psychological burden of responsibility. This is not always a calculated or malicious act. In many cases, the person is not fully aware that they are engaging in denial. The mind has a remarkable ability to distort or reshape reality in order to maintain a stable self-image. If someone sees themselves as a good person, admitting harmful behavior threatens that identity. Instead of adjusting their self-perception, they adjust their perception of the event. They may minimize what happened, convince themselves it wasn't serious, or assume that you have already moved on. Denial also thrives in environments where accountability is uncomfortable or unfamiliar. If a person has never been taught how to take responsibility for their actions, they may default to avoidance. Facing the truth requires emotional maturity, the ability to sit with discomfort, reflect honestly, and accept imperfection. Without these skills, denial becomes a habitual response. It feels safer to ignore the problem than to risk the vulnerability that comes with acknowledging it. Another layer of denial involves control. By acting as though nothing happened, the person subtly dictates the narrative of the situation. Silence can become a form of power. If they don't acknowledge the hurt, it creates uncertainty for you. You may begin to question your own experience, wondering whether you misunderstood or overreacted. This confusion shifts the focus away from their behavior and onto your perception, allowing them to avoid accountability while maintaining emotional distance. Denial is also closely tied to fear of confrontation, fear of rejection, and fear of consequences. Admitting wrongdoing opens the door to difficult conversations and potential conflict. For some, this is more intimidating than the act of hurting someone in the first place, so they choose avoidance, hoping that time will erase the issue or that silence will be mistaken for resolution. Over time, repeated denial can shape a person's entire way of interacting with others. It creates a pattern where problems are never truly addressed, only buried. This leads to shallow relationships, unresolved tension, and a lack of genuine emotional connection. The individual becomes trapped in a cycle where they cannot grow because growth requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is precisely what denial prevents. For the person on the receiving end, encountering denial can be deeply disorienting. It challenges your sense of reality and can make you feel invisible. When your pain is not recognized, it may feel as though it doesn't matter. This is where understanding denial becomes important, not to excuse the behavior, but to see it clearly. Recognizing denial allows you to separate your experience from their avoidance, helping you hold on to your truth without needing their validation. When someone hurts you and then behaves as if nothing happened, it is easy to assume the worst, that their actions were calculated, cold, and deliberate. However, human behavior is rarely that simple. There is an important distinction between emotional immaturity and intentional harm, and understanding this difference can completely change how you interpret the situation. Emotional immaturity is not about age, it is about emotional development. A person can be intellectually capable, socially functional, and still lack the inner tools required to navigate complex emotional situations. These individuals often struggle with self-awareness, empathy, and accountability. When they cause harm, it is not always because they want to hurt someone, but because they lack the ability to fully understand or process the impact of their actions. An emotionally immature person tends to react impulsively. They may say things in anger, withdraw without explanation, or behave in ways that prioritize their immediate comfort over someone else's feelings. When the moment passes, instead of reflecting on what happened, they move on as if the situation resolved itself. In their mind, the absence of visible conflict means everything is fine. This is not because they don't care at all, but because they don't know how to sit with discomfort long enough to address it. One of the defining traits of emotional immaturity is avoidance. Confrontation feels overwhelming, so they escape it. Apologizing requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels unsafe. Taking responsibility means admitting imperfection, which can threaten their fragile sense of self. As a result, they choose the path of least resistance, silence, normal behavior, and an unspoken expectation that time will smooth everything over. Intentional harm, on the other hand, operates from a very different place. It involves awareness and choice. A person who intentionally harms someone understands, at least on some level, that their actions will cause pain. In some cases, this behavior is driven by a desire for control, power, or emotional manipulation. Unlike emotional immaturity, which is rooted in limitation, intentional harm is rooted in willingness. The individual knows the impact and proceeds anyway. The difficulty lies in the fact that both can look the same from the outside. In both cases, the person may hurt you and then act as if nothing happened. The silence, the lack of apology, the return to normal behavior, it all appears identical. But the internal motivations are very different. One stems from an inability to handle emotions, while the other stems from a disregard for them. This distinction matters because it shapes how you respond. If the behavior comes from emotional immaturity, there is often a pattern of inconsistency rather than calculated intent. The person may show care in some moments and insensitivity in others. Their actions are not aligned because their emotional understanding is underdeveloped. This does not make the hurt any less real, but it provides context for why it happens. With intentional harm, the pattern is usually more consistent and strategic. There may be repeated behaviors that undermine control or dismiss you. The lack of acknowledgement is not just avoidance, it becomes part of the behavior itself. It reinforces a dynamic where your feelings are minimized and their actions go unquestioned. Understanding this difference does not mean excusing either behavior. Emotional immaturity can still cause deep wounds, and intentional harm is clearly destructive. The key lies in recognizing what you are dealing with so that you can respond from clarity rather than confusion. When you understand that some people lack the emotional capacity to meet you where you are, it shifts your expectations. When you recognize intentional harm, it sharpens your awareness of boundaries and self-protection. In both cases, the absence of acknowledgement reflects something about the other person, not a lack of value in your experience. It highlights either a limitation in emotional growth or a conscious choice to avoid responsibility. The impact on you may feel the same, but the underlying reasons reveal very different psychological realities. When someone hurts you and then carries on as if nothing happened, it creates a silent imbalance, one that is not immediately visible, but deeply felt. On one side, there is your pain, real, heavy, and unresolved. On the other, there is their comfort, protected, undisturbed, and carefully maintained. This contrast reveals a difficult truth about human behavior. Many people will choose their own emotional comfort, even if it means ignoring someone else's pain. Pain demands attention. It asks to be acknowledged, understood, and processed. When you are hurt, your mind naturally seeks clarity. You replay moments, analyze words, and try to make sense of what happened. This is not overthinking. It is your mind attempting to restore balance. You want recognition, not necessarily revenge. You want the reality of your experience to be seen and validated. Comfort, however, operates differently. Comfort seeks stability, ease, and the absence of tension. For the person who caused the pain, acknowledging what they did would disrupt that comfort. It would introduce guilt, responsibility, and the need for change. Instead of facing that discomfort, they may unconsciously choose to preserve their emotional state by acting as though nothing is wrong. This is where the disconnect begins. While you are trying to process the pain, they are trying to avoid it. Your focus is on understanding, theirs is on maintaining peace, at least their version of it. This creates a situation where two realities exist at the same time. In your reality, something significant happened. In theirs, it is either minimized or ignored altogether. The choice of comfort over accountability is often not as obvious as it seems. It does not always come from cruelty or lack of care. In many cases, it comes from an inability to handle emotional complexity. Admitting fault requires self-reflection, and self-reflection can be uncomfortable. It forces a person to confront parts of themselves they would rather not see. For those who are not equipped to do this, avoidance becomes the easier path. There is also a subtle form of self-preservation involved. By not acknowledging your pain, they protect their self-image. They can continue to see themselves as reasonable, kind, or justified. If they were to fully accept the impact of their actions, it might challenge that identity. So instead, they maintain their comfort by leaving your experience unaddressed. For you, this can feel deeply invalidating. It is not just the original hurt that lingers, it is the silence that follows. The absence of acknowledgement can amplify the pain, making it feel invisible. You may begin to question whether your feelings are too intense or whether you're expecting too much. This internal conflict adds another layer to the experience, one that can be just as difficult as the initial wound. Over time, this dynamic can shift your focus away from your own needs. You may start adjusting your expectations to match their behavior. You might convince yourself to let things go without resolution, not because you have healed, but because addressing it feels pointless. This is how your pain slowly gets overshadowed by their comfort. There is also a deeper psychological pattern at play. When someone consistently chooses their comfort over your emotional reality, it establishes an unspoken hierarchy. Their feelings take priority while yours becomes secondary. This imbalance can shape the way the relationship functions, creating a space where your voice is less heard and your experiences are less acknowledged. Recognizing this pattern is important because it brings clarity to what is happening beneath the surface. It is not just about a single incident, it is about how emotional responsibility is distributed. When one person carries the weight of the pain and the other avoids it, the relationship becomes uneven. Understanding this dynamic does not erase the hurt, but it helps you see it for what it is. It allows you to separate your need for acknowledgement from their need for comfort, and to recognize that their avoidance is a reflection of their own limitations rather than a measure of your worth. When someone hurts you and then acts as if nothing happened, the immediate reaction is often emotional turbulence, confusion, frustration, and a strong urge to seek answers. You want acknowledgement, an explanation, or at the very least, recognition that something meaningful occurred. In that moment, it can feel as though all the power lies with them. They control the narrative by saying nothing, while you are left carrying the emotional weight of what happened. But beneath this surface dynamic, something quieter begins to unfold, a silent power shift. At first, the imbalance is clear. They appear unaffected, moving forward without pause, while you remain emotionally engaged, trying to process and understand. This creates the illusion that they are in control. Their indifference feels like strength, and your emotional response may feel like vulnerability. However, this perception is often misleading. The true shift begins the moment you start observing rather than reacting. When you step back from the need for immediate answers, you begin to see the situation with greater clarity. You notice patterns, inconsistencies, and behaviors that may have been overlooked before. Instead of being pulled deeper into emotional confusion, you create space between your feelings and their actions. This space is where awareness grows, and with awareness comes a different kind of power, one that is not loud or confrontational, but steady and self-contained. Silence, in this context, takes on a new meaning. Initially, their silence may have felt like avoidance or dismissal. But as the shift occurs, your silence becomes intentional. It is no longer about waiting for them to speak. It is about choosing not to chase what they are unwilling to address. This change may not be visible on the outside, but internally it redefines the entire dynamic. Power is often misunderstood as control over others, but in reality, it is rooted in control over oneself. When your emotional state is dependent on their acknowledgement, they hold influence over how you feel. Their words, or lack of them, determine your sense of closure. The silent power shift happens when that dependency begins to dissolve. You stop seeking validation from someone who avoids responsibility. You stop explaining your pain to someone who refuses to understand it. This does not mean that your feelings disappear. It means that your relationship to those feelings changes. Instead of directing your energy outward toward them, you begin to reclaim it for yourself. There is also a shift in perception. What once felt like rejection or indifference starts to reveal something deeper about the other person. Their inability to address the situation becomes more apparent, not as a form of strength, but as a limitation. You begin to see that their silence is not power, it is avoidance. And avoidance, over time, carries its own consequences, even if they are not immediately visible. As this awareness grows, your behavior naturally changes. You may speak less, but your silence is no longer filled with expectation. You may distance yourself not out of resentment, but out of understanding. You recognize that continuing to seek resolution from someone who cannot provide it only prolongs the imbalance. This shift is subtle because it does not rely on confrontation or external validation. There are no dramatic declarations or visible turning points. Instead, it unfolds internally, reshaping how you engage with the situation. Your reactions become more measured, your thoughts more grounded, and your sense of self less dependent on their actions. Over time, this internal change alters the external dynamic as well. The person who once held unspoken control through their silence no longer has the same influence. Without your emotional pursuit, the imbalance begins to dissolve. Whether they notice this change or not becomes less important, because the shift was never about them. It was about you reclaiming your position within your own emotional world. The silent power shift is not about winning or proving a point. It is about recognizing where your power truly lies and allowing that awareness to guide your response. Rather than your initial emotional reaction, there is a common belief that healing requires closure, that in order to move forward, there must be a conversation, an apology, or a clear resolution that explains everything. It creates the expectation that peace comes from the other person acknowledging what they did, validating your pain, and offering some form of emotional repair. But in reality, closure is not always given. In many situations, especially when someone hurts you and acts like nothing happened, closure remains absent. This absence can feel deeply unsettling. The mind seeks completion. It wants to understand why something happened, to connect the emotional dots, and to place the experience into a coherent narrative. Without that clarity, the situation feels unfinished, almost as if it is still happening in the background. Questions linger, and the lack of answers can keep you emotionally tied to the moment long after it has passed. Healing without closure begins with recognizing that the need for answers, while natural, can also become a barrier. When your sense of resolution depends entirely on another person's willingness to provide it, your healing is placed outside of your control. You may find yourself waiting for an apology, for an explanation, for acknowledgement that may never come. This waiting can quietly extend the pain, keeping it active rather than allowing it to settle. One of the most difficult shifts is accepting that not all stories come with explanations. People do not always offer reasons for their behavior, and even when they do, those reasons may not bring the clarity you are seeking. In some cases, the explanation itself may feel incomplete or unsatisfying. This reveals a deeper truth. Closure is not always about the information you receive, but about the meaning you assign to the experience. Without external closure, the process turns inward. Instead of asking, why did they do this? The question gradually becomes, what does this experience mean for me? This shift changes the focus from their actions to your understanding. It allows you to interpret the situation in a way that aligns with your values rather than relying on their perspective to define it. Healing in this way requires a certain level of emotional independence. It involves acknowledging your pain without needing it to be confirmed by someone else. Your experience becomes valid because you felt it, not because someone else agrees with it. This can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you are used to seeking resolution through communication. But over time, It creates a more stable foundation for healing, one that is not dependent on external responses. There is also an element of acceptance involved, though not in the sense of approving what happened. Acceptance, in this context, means recognizing reality as it is. It means understanding that the other person may never take responsibility, may never apologize, and may never even acknowledge the impact of their actions. This recognition does not erase the hurt, but it prevents you from being caught in a cycle of expectation and disappointment. As healing progresses, the emotional intensity of the experience begins to change. The memory may still exist, but it no longer carries the same weight. This is not because the situation was resolved externally, but because it was processed internally. You have made sense of it in your own way, allowing it to become part of your understanding rather than a source of ongoing confusion. Healing without closure also reshapes how you approach future experiences. It strengthens your ability to trust your own perception, even in the absence of validation. It encourages clearer boundaries as you become more aware of what you will and will not accept. The absence of closure, while initially painful, can lead to a deeper form of clarity, one that is not dependent on others, but rooted in your own awareness and interpretation.